Welcome to the temple. I want to talk about something that has come to my attention fairly recently, and it's kind of mixed in with Mary Magdalene as sacred prostitute or sacred whore or holy whore or sexual priestess. And I know there are a lot of people who tell the story that she was trained in the temples of Isis as a sex priestess, and I think I know where that narrative comes from, and I personally reject it. I just don't accept that that is truth. When I read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, when I read the Gospel of the Beloved Companion and the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene, that's not her story. She has such amazing teachings to share with us, and she knew what it was like to reach enlightenment. She is an ascended master, and her story is so much more than being someone who was trained in sexual art so that she could help Yeshua go through his final ordeal. But I know there are a lot of people who use that narrative to work on their own sexual liberation, and I wonder about the connotations of those words. I wonder about the idea that our sexuality has to go from being something that we were maybe ashamed about or shamed for, feel disgusted in, have experienced trauma around, to something that is wholly sacred and is for a divine purpose. It's like the other end of the pendulum. And sex is like anything. It can be used and be good or bad. And that middle path, which I think Mary Magdalene was really trying to show us, being fully human and fully divine, that middle path of it just being what it is, not having to dress it up as something that is for a spiritual purpose or make ourselves feel somehow more erotic, exotic with our sexuality, that, you know, it's a temple priestess thing. Just it being what it is, that we have these physical bodies that have natural drives, and we are built physically to connect with another, and just coming to terms with sex as it is, the whole spectrum of what it is, and not necessarily having to almost be performative in a way with our sexuality. And I understand that for people who have been through trauma, whether it's shame or whether it's physical trauma, sometimes it can help to see whatever that trauma is through a different lens and reframe it into something more positive. But I also think there are a lot of women who are coming to this work who perhaps haven't had any major traumas. I think all women have had trauma of some kind when it comes to sexuality, even if that is being shamed for it, or just naturally growing up feeling that it's wrong, or that we're bad, or we're evil, or that we need to cover up because we don't want to attract men because that's dangerous, or whatever it is. But I think there are a lot of women who come to the idea of Mary Magdalene as a sacred prostitute, for whom it would probably be healthier to just embrace their sexuality as it is, just as an innate part of who we are. In recent years, there have been some discussions, articles written saying that perhaps temple prostitution wasn't quite what we thought it was, and it maybe even wasn't really a big thing. There are some people who say that certain words have been misinterpreted. There are some examples where archaeological evidence that's been used to prop up the idea of sacred prostitution, it really doesn't stand up when you examine it. And also that if it was going on, it maybe was more along the lines of, say, you know, a cult leader who brings in women and then pimps them out to men for sacred purposes, for a donation towards their god. A bit how like the church used to say, if you give us money, we'll pray more for you to go into heaven, you know. For me, when it comes to Mary Magdalene, as a woman who was already misidentified in a way at the time that was shameful, right? She was already labeled in that way. For that to be carried on when she has such a bigger story to tell is such a shame to me. The other thing that I don't like is the fact that even after the church came out and said that, you know, they got it wrong, she wasn't a prostitute, there are still people today within the church who say that we should still see her that way, because if there's hope for a prostitute, well, there's hope for anyone. You know, as if Mary Magdalene's redemption through Yeshua was like, you know, she was the worst sinner there could be because she was a prostitute, which I personally feel that there are a lot worse things that people can do than be a sex worker, and be redeemed from. You know, the idea that you would need to be redeemed after being a sex worker is abhorrent to me. You know, there are many reasons why women choose to go into sex work, and it's not always of their choice either. So I don't like it from that narrative. The other thing that I think this opens up is a wider discussion around sex work in general and our attitude towards sexuality. And maybe it's a different video, but I read recently there was a study where 40 to 60% of the young men who were asked in that study, how do you feel about women? And they felt that women weren't interested in them, they weren't approachable. 40 to 60% of those young men had never approached a woman to ask her out on a date. And I've been dipping my toe into what might be known as the manosphere online, but also just young men who don't have a big following, who aren't particularly, you know, you might say right-wing, who are trying to encourage other young men to get out into the world, stop paying for things like OnlyFans, and to actually interact with real women. Because it seems that we do have this issue that a lot of young men are so afraid of rejection. And of course, we've had a lot of movements that have been really good for women, that have got our voices out there and made people think again about how women are treated. But it's also been detrimental to the young masculine generation that's coming up now, because they are afraid, and they are becoming more afraid of interacting with a woman in the wrong way, in a way that might get them in trouble. And so it's just easier for them to have a relationship with a girl online who has, you know, however many OnlyFans or clients or whatever, and they can just sit behind their desk and get that instant gratification that so many of us fall into within so many areas of our life. You know, instant gratification is becoming just, it's touching every area of our life, with food, shopping, sex, whatever. When we have this talk about sexual liberation for women, and that includes things like sex work becoming more mainstream, more something that is acceptable for women to pursue as a career. And I understand that it, you know, men also provide sexual services, but, you know, being realistic, it's usually the women providing the service and the men paying for it. When we are moving in that direction as a society, what is that doing to our generation, our next generation that are coming up of young men and young women, men who are too afraid to approach women and don't really need to, because they have sex on tap. They don't even have to leave their house. They don't have to curb crawl or whatever. And then the young women that these men would be dating but now are not. What does that do to our society and this kind of sexual revolution that we've had? It just makes me wonder how useful is it to tell women that pursuing sex work is something that's just the same as like being a teacher or a cook or a dancer or whatever? What does it do to our society? And as I read more and more the story of Miriam or Mary and Yeshua, I understand that, you know, the sexual element to their relationship was so much more than even sacred sex. You know, it just was so much more than that. And to hone in on that as her archetype is to miss out on 99% of the message that she has for us. We face a lot of challenges in our world today, and things seem to get more and more difficult to navigate with technology, artificial intelligence, and I just really feel that more mindfulness needs to come into every conversation that we have, to pause before we hit the button and to think about the 7 generations that are to come after us and the effect that our actions will have on them. Thank you for joining me in the temple today. Many blessings.